Tonight, we drift back to Charleston, South Carolina, in the year 1820, a city of grand plantations, rotting alleyways, and a justice system that loved spectacle more than truth. 6 miles outside its gates stood a roadside inn, the 6 Mile House, where travelers stopped for warmth, for tea, for rest. Some never returned. They say the beds opened like jaws. They say the tea was poisoned. They say the woman who welcomed them, dressed always in white, was no hostess at all, but predator in lace. Her name was Lavinia Fisher, and when Charleston dragged her to gallows, she didn't tremble or beg. She laughed in their faces and hurled a curse into the crowd. If any of you have a message for the devil, tell me now, for I shall be seeing him shortly. The courts called her a criminal. The city called her a murderess. And 2 centuries later, her name still clings to Charleston streets like smoke. She stood the gallows in Charleston, South Carolina, her figure wrapped in a white dress that clung like a funeral shroud. The crowd below jeered, spat, shouted damnations, because this was not supposed to be a woman. Women weren't supposed to die on the scaffold in America, not then. And yet, here she was, Lavinia Fisher, accused murderer, highwaywoman, a demon in petticoats. The rope hung above her, like a question mark drawn by God himself. The story should have ended with fear, with trembling, with desperate pleas for mercy. But instead, she did something else. Something that froze even the rowdiest heckler mid-taunt. Lavinia turned, eyes burning with defiance, and screamed into the crowd. If any of you have a message to the devil, tell me now, for I shall be seeing him shortly. That wasn't just a last word. It was a curse, spit in the face of salvation, a final act of rebellion so sharp it carved her name into legend. No prayer, no repentance, no softening of voice. Just a raw challenge hurled at the abyss. And then the trapdoor fell. Some say her body twitched like a marionette in hell's own play. Some say she smiled even as her neck snapped. But what can't be denied is this. Lavinia Fisher became the first woman executed by hanging in the United States, and the mythology of her crimes and her curse would cling to Charleston soil like a stain that never washed out. And here is where the dread sets in, because the further you dig, the more you realize the story doesn't fit neatly into history. Did Lavinia Fisher actually run a murderous roadside inn, luring travelers to their doom with poisoned tea and trapdoors that swallowed them whole? Or was she merely a woman punished more for her audacity than her crimes? The legend says one thing, the record another, and between them lies something worse. A chasm of truth so warped by fear, gossip, and power that it becomes impossible to tell where reality ends and folklore begins. Lavinia Fisher is not just a ghost story. They still whisper her name in Charleston, half in horror, half in awe. She was flesh, she was bone, and she was executed by a system that found her easier to demonize than to understand. And if the devil really did receive her, I imagine even he had to lean in and ask, "What on earth happened to you?" Charleston, South Carolina, in the early 1800s was not the postcard fantasy people like to sell today. Forget cobblestone horse rides and pastel houses with iron balconies. This was a city swollen with contradictions. It was wealth and rot stitched together in the same fabric. Ships poured into the harbor with silks, sugar, slaves. Money dripped through the streets, but so did disease, corruption, and the stench of fear. By 1819, the roads leading into Charleston were dangerous arteries. Highwaymen stalked travelers, gangs roamed the dirt paths, and the promise of wealth made every stranger a potential victim. The city was guarded by militia, yes, but there was always the sense that civilization was just one candle away from being blown out by the chaos of the frontier. Enter the 6 Mile Wayfarer House, an inn set 6 miles outside of Charleston, perched along the road like a spider's web waiting for flies. It was not elegant, not respectable, but it was essential. Tired travelers, merchants, tradesmen, anyone seeking rest before entering the city, they passed through there, and what they found would then depended entirely on who you believe. If you ask the legends, the Wayfarer House was hell's lobby. Guests were welcomed by Lavinia and her husband John with smiles, warm food, maybe a cup of tea. But that tea, the whispers claimed, was laced with poison. When the guests became weak, dazed, unable to fight back, they'd be led upstairs to their rooms. And that's when the nightmare began. The bed itself was a trap, a hinge contraption that flipped open like a carnival trick, dropping the unlucky traveler into a pit beneath the house where death waited in darkness. It sounds like something ripped out of a pulp novel. Sweeney Todd, but with teacups and trapdoors instead of razors and pies. Too elaborate to be true, too deliciously macabre not to spread. But remember, Charleston was a city teetering between fear and paranoia. Tales of highway robberies were already common. Throw in a beautiful woman rumored to be in on it, and you had a story irresistible to the gossiping public. Because here's the other side. Charleston society, prim and proper in its drawing rooms, had little tolerance for women who refused to be docile. Lavinia Fisher wasn't meek, wasn't soft-spoken, and she had no interest in being invisible. She and John ran the inn together, but Lavinia was the face people remembered, the sharp-tongued woman in white, standing shoulder to shoulder with men, unafraid to glare back at authority. That alone was enough to make her dangerous in the eyes of polite society. And so, in a city built on reputation and shadows, the stage was set. Was the 6-mile Wayfarer house a slaughterhouse of travelers, or just a den of petty criminals inflated into Gothic nightmare by rumor and rage? The truth is tangled in Charleston's cobweb of fear. But everyone agreed on one thing. Lavinia Fisher was no ordinary innkeeper. She was trouble. Lavinia Fisher. Her name drips from Charleston's lips like a curse. But when you start scraping at the layers, you find less clarity and more distortion. Who is she really? A murderous femme fatale, luring men to their doom with poison hospitality? Or a poor woman caught in the machinery of fear, her image twisted into a devil mask that history was all too happy to parade? The records give us only fragments. Born somewhere in the late 18th century, likely in South Carolina, Lavinia wasn't some aristocrat with silk gloves and porcelain skin. She was of the working class, someone who scraped together a living with her husband, John. Together, they ran the 6-mile Wayfarer house, a roadside inn, hardly glamorous, but steady enough to keep food on the table. Yet descriptions of her vary wildly. Some called her beautiful, with sharp features and an almost theatrical presence. Others painted her as terrifying, with cold eyes that could peel a man's soul like fruit. Even her white dress, a detail that clings to her legend, wasn't just fabric. It was armor. It made her unforgettable, a figure etched into memory like chalk on a tombstone. But here's the thing. For every lurid tale of Lavinia serving poison tea, there are equal whispers that she never touched the stuff, that she was never even proven to kill anyone at all. Charleston's courts and newspapers wanted a villain, and Lavinia, outspoken, fearless, and married to a man knee-deep in criminal activity, was too perfect to resist. Her husband, John Fisher, is often forgotten half of the equation. He too was accused of robbery, violence, and skulking with highwaymen. But history remembers him as an accessory. Lavinia? She became the headline. And why? Because she was a woman who wouldn't bow. She met male aggression not with silence, but with steel. And in a society still suffocating under patriarchal decorum, that was enough to make her monstrous. Even the prison records echo this duality. Some accounts describe Lavinia as defiant, laughing at the law, taunting her captors, refusing to kneel. Others claim she broke down, wept bitterly, begged for forgiveness. Which version is true? Both? Neither? Or is it just another layer of storytelling, twisted by whoever was holding the pen? And so, Lavinia Fisher became more myth than woman, a puzzle piece hammered into place by Charleston's fear and fury. Maybe she was a murderer. Maybe she was just guilty of being loud, visible, and unafraid to play a man's game in a world that punished women for stepping out of line. But whether sinner or scapegoat, she walked the earth with undeniable force. Enough that 2 centuries later, we're still whispering her name, still asking who exactly Lavinia Fisher really was. It begins with a man named John Peoples. At least, that's the story Charleston clung to. Peoples was a traveler heading toward the city, and by nightfall, he sought refuge at the infamous 6-mile house. He was tired, wary, but not stupid. He had heard whispers about travelers disappearing along the road. Yet the warmth of the inn, the hospitality of Lavinia and her husband, it lulled him into staying. The legend paints a scene like this. Lavinia smiled sweetly, handed him a cup of tea, and encouraged him to drink. But something about the flavor, the sharp, bitter undercurrent, made him hesitate. He didn't swallow it. Instead, he discreetly poured it out when no one was looking. That's the first escape. Later, Lavinia, or perhaps John, led him to a room. A bed waiting, clean sheets. Peoples laid down but couldn't quite silence the scratching of doubt in his skull. And then movement, a groan, a mechanism. The bed, they say, began to tilt, to collapse, to open into some hellish pit. Peoples leapt up, scrambling, clawing at the floorboards. He escaped through a window, running into the night like a man chased by demons. That's the tale, anyway, the one that made the rounds in Charleston's taverns, swelling bigger with every retelling. Peoples became the first survivor of Lavinia's murderous hospitality. His story proof that something was rotten at 6 Mile. But here's the problem. Historians digging through court documents centuries later found no clear mention of Peoples' testimony. The trapdoor bed? Suspiciously absent from official records. Poison tea? Murky at best. The whole account might have been nothing more than folklore dressed in facts clothing. Yet in 1819, rumor was as good as evidence. And Peoples' story, real or imagined, was the spark that ignited the fire. After this, suspicion spiraled. Reports of missing travelers were tied to the Fishers Inn. Roadside gangs were blamed, and Lavinia and John were swept up in the accusations. People were convinced that the 6 Mile house wasn't an inn at all, but a slaughterhouse in disguise. What matters here is less whether John Peoples existed exactly as the story tells, and more how a supposed escape planted a seed in Charleston's collective mind. Suddenly, the Fishers weren't just shady innkeepers tied to highwaymen. They were predators, and their lair was a nest of horror. Once a town believes it has uncovered a monster, the rest doesn't matter. Facts are irrelevant. The story is enough. And in the case of Lavinia Fisher, that first disturbance, that first whispered tale of poison tea and trapdoor beds, was all Charleston needed to tighten the noose. By the time the rumors of the 6 Mile house had sunk their teeth into Charleston, the city was in a frenzy. Travelers were vanishing. Merchants who took the wrong road never returned. And every missing man was laid at Lavinia's doorstep, whether there was evidence or not. It didn't matter if highway gangs were prowling the countryside or if desperate thieves picked off the vulnerable. Charleston wanted a face to attach to fear, and Lavinia's face, sharp and unyielding, became that mask. Reports spiraled into grotesque. Some claimed dozens of bodies were unearthed near the inn. Pits full of skeletal remains, stacked like cordwood beneath the floorboards. Others swore Lavinia personally slit throats as her husband stripped the bodies for valuables. One version even described the walls of the inn themselves whispering with the voices of the dead. It was Gothic horror spun into gossip, and the more lurid it became, the more people believed it. But when you dig into the actual trial records, a quieter, stranger truth emerges. There were no bodies stacked in heaps. No documented trapdoors swallowing travelers whole. No neatly labeled ledger of victims. Instead, the Fishers were charged primarily with highway robbery, not murder. The grand legend of Lavinia as America's first female serial killer starts to collapse the moment you press too hard on it. So where did the stories come from? Perhaps from fear itself. Charleston's wealthy elite depended on smooth roads, on safe travel for their goods and families. Any disruption, any whiff of chaos, threatened their carefully balanced order. And chaos, as always, needed a scapegoat. And Lavinia, she was perfect, a woman in white, running an inn in the shadows, standing shoulder to shoulder with criminals. She didn't apologize. She didn't soften her words. She met gossip with fire. People don't like their nightmares quiet and vague. They like them personified, dressed in white, glaring at them from the gallows. The deeper you look, the more contradictions appear. If Lavinia was truly a poisoner, where are the confirmed victims? If the trapdoor bed was real, why is it absent from the records? Why does every detail feel like it was embroidered after the fact, growing more elaborate with each telling, like a ghost story designed to keep children from wandering too far from home? This is the part where the case begins to feel less like history and more like theater. Lavinia Fisher became a character written into Charleston's Gothic script. her supposed crimes amplified with every retelling until truth itself drowned. But Charleston wasn't just hungry for horror. It wanted justice, or at least a spectacle that looked like justice. And that hunger would soon drag Lavinia and John into a courtroom where the line between fact and folklore was already so blurred, it barely existed at all. The Charleston authorities finally descended on the 6 Mile house in 1819, armed not with forensic brilliance, but with suspicion thick enough to choke on. What they found was a gang of men operating out of the inn. Thieves, bandits, robbers who had been terrorizing the road for months. John and Lavinia Fisher were right in the middle of it. The charges? Highway robbery. That was the official crime. Not murder. Not serial killing. Robbery. And yet, within days, whispers of bodies and poisoned tea swarmed to the city like flies on a carcass. The Fishers weren't merely lawbreakers anymore. They were something darker. The investigation itself was more witch trial than police work. Neighbors and travelers brought forward stories, but they contradicted one another. Some insisted they'd been offered tea by Lavinia, found themselves dizzy and disoriented, but managed to escape. Others admitted they'd simply heard it from someone else. No one produced actual bodies. No one could prove the inn had been a slaughterhouse. But the court of public opinion didn't care about absence of evidence. Charleston was already sharpening its rope. One theory at the time was simple. The Fishers really had been running a murderous enterprise, with Lavinia playing the role of the bait. A beautiful woman draws in weary men, offers comfort, and then poison, robbery, death. It fits neatly into a morality tale, the kind society loves to pass around. A warning against lust, against straying too far from propriety, against trusting the wrong smile. Another theory, whispered by those skeptical of the hysteria, is that the Fishers were scapegoats. Highway robbery was rampant across the South Carolina countryside, and powerful men wanted someone to take the fall. Lavinia's visibility, her reputation for being fiery and unrepentant, made her irresistible as a symbol. She wasn't just accused of crime. She was accused of being the wrong kind of woman. Then there's a possibility that truth sat somewhere between. Maybe Lavinia and John did run with criminals. Maybe they did lure travelers in, not to murder them, but to rob them blind. Violence may have happened. Killings may have occurred. But the details, the trapdoor beds, the poisoned tea, the mass graves, could have been exaggerations, myths piled on top of crimes until they became something else entirely. What's undeniable is this. The legend of Lavinia Fisher was already being written before the trial was finished. Charleston didn't just want justice. It wanted theater. And in Lavinia, with her defiant gaze and her refusal to beg, they had found the perfect villainess to fill the stage. The investigation wasn't about truth. It was about constructing a monster the city could hang, and then sleep a little easier, pretending the darkness had been banished. The trial was theater, and everyone in Charleston bought a ticket. The Fishers were paraded into the courtroom not as mere suspects, but as living embodiments of sin. John looked the part of the outlaw, grizzled, surly, guilty by association. But Lavinia, she stole the stage, a woman in white, striking, unafraid to glare at the men who were already writing her death sentence. When the verdict came down, guilty of highway robbery, it wasn't supposed to mean death. Robbery was punishable by prison, not the gallows. But Charleston wanted a hanging. So the court twisted the law. Robbery, when committed with violence, could be a capital offense. And suddenly, Lavinia and John were standing at the edge of the noose. It's here the myth thickens. Some accounts say Lavinia broke down, wept bitterly, begged the governor for mercy. Others say she laughed in the courtroom, daring anyone to condemn her. The contradictions are maddening. Was she a broken woman dragged into her husband's sins? Or was she the unapologetic mastermind of it all? The truth, as always, depends on who was holding the quill. But the turning point wasn't just a guilty verdict. It was a denial of a pardon. John and Lavinia both appealed to Governor John Geddes, insisting they were innocent, insisting they'd been railroaded by gossip. Geddes refused. And just like that, the sentence became real. Prison accounts say John softened, found religion, confessed his sins, and prepared for death with trembling humility. Lavinia? She hardened. She refused to wear black for mourning. Instead, she demanded to be executed in her wedding dress. a bright white gown, as if daring Charleston to remember her not as a criminal but as a bride betrayed. The breakdown wasn't hers. It was Charleston's. A city that prided itself on civility was frothing at the mouth for a spectacle. Crowds gathered outside the jail, demanding to see the murderess strung up. Newspapers fed them lurid headlines, describing Lavinia as a monster with the beauty of Eve and the venom of the serpent. And then, the morning of the execution arrived. John walked first, whispering prayers, begging forgiveness. Lavinia followed, head held high, her white dress gleaming in the sun like mockery. She climbed the gallows without a single plea, looked into a crowd of faces, neighbors, strangers, enemies, and spat her immortal words. If any of you have a message for the devil, tell me now, for I shall be seeing him shortly. This was not contrition. This was defiance, a woman tearing the script out of Charleston's hands and writing her own ending. And as the trapdoor fell, so did the city's illusion of justice, replaced instead with the echo of her curse. So, what was Lavinia Fisher actually guilty of? Strip away the trapdoor legends, the poison tea, the horror movie theatrics, and what remains is this: highway robbery, carried out with her husband and their gang. That is what the court convicted her of. That is what put the rope around her neck. No bodies, no list of murder travelers, no forensic evidence of poison, nothing that would stand up in even the weakest of modern trials. And yet, Charleston still insists she was America's first female serial killer. Why? Because the story is too intoxicating to let go. The official resolution is brutally simple. John and Lavinia Fisher were executed on February 18, 1820. Their bodies were buried in a potter's field. Case closed, justice served, or so the court declared. But the lingering questions linger precisely because the case was never that neat. Did Lavinia actually kill anyone? Or was she condemned more for being unrepentant? Too defiant to play the role of the weeping, penitent woman society wanted her to be? Was the 6 Mile House really a death trap, or just a shabby and caught up in Charleston's paranoia? Was the famous John Peoples story a true account of survival, or just folklore grafted onto her trial to make the hanging more palatable? And perhaps the most chilling question of all, did Charleston execute a murderer, or did it create one? By branding Lavinia Fisher a monster, by exaggerating her crimes into legend, by hanging her not for proven murder but for the myth of it, did the city, in a sense, write her into being? Every retelling adds new horrors. Some say her ghost still haunts the old city jail, pacing in her wedding gown, daring visitors to look her in the eye. Others claim she appears along the road where the 6 Mile House once stood, a specter offering poison tea to unlucky travelers. The folklore insists she was real, her crimes undeniable. The history shakes its head, pointing to empty evidence boxes and contradictory records. Resolution? Hardly. The only thing Charleston resolved was the execution itself. The rest, truth, lies, and the shadowy space in between, was left to ferment. And in that ferment, Lavinia Fisher became something far more enduring than a condemned criminal. She became a myth, sharpened by the gallows and preserved in whispers. And the deeper you stare into her story, the harder it is to tell whether you're looking at a woman or at the reflection of a city desperate for monsters. Charleston tried to wash its hands of the Fishers the moment the trapdoors slammed shut. 2 bodies buried, 2 names scratched into the court ledgers, and that was supposed to be the end of it. But the thing about myths is, they refuse to stay buried. If anything, the gallows gave Lavinia Fisher more life than she ever had in flesh. Almost immediately, stories sprouted like weeds. The 6 Mile House was whispered about as if it had been a slaughterhouse, its rooms echoing with the screams of nameless men. Ghost tales spread of travelers who checked in and never checked out. Every missing person, every unexplained disappearance along Charleston's roads for decades after, people muttered the same name, Lavinia. The city itself capitalized on it, whether they admitted it or not. The old city jail, where Lavinia spent her last days, is now one of Charleston's most famous haunted landmarks. Tour guides relish her defiance, her final words, the image of a woman in white pacing to the cells with fury still smoldering in her eyes. Hotel souvenir shops, even ghost tours spin her curse into currency. Charleston buried her body, yes, but her legend pays rent every Halloween. And yet, behind the commercialization, there's something darker. Lavinia Fisher is often described as America's first female serial killer, but that title isn't earned through evidence. It's earned through fear and performance. Her real legacy may not be in murder, but in how society treats women who refuse to bow. Her trial shows us that Charleston was more terrified of an unrepentant woman than of highway robbery itself. John Fisher died a thief. Lavinia Fisher died a monster. Even historians today can't resist the allure. Some argue she was a blood-soaked killer, lost in time but kept alive by ghost stories. Others insist she was a scapegoat, smeared with convenient horror, because her defiance rattled the social order. Both sides circle the same problem. The truth is irretrievable. The files are too thin, the rumors too thick, the reality too warped by spectacle. But perhaps that's the truest legacy Lavinia left, the inability to pin her down. She is a mirror, reflecting whatever fear you bring with you. To believers, she's a vengeful ghost, a cursed bride of death still stalking Charleston. To skeptics, she's a victim of a misogynistic system, rewritten as a cautionary tale. And to Charleston, she's a story too good to let die, a woman trapped forever between history and nightmare. There's a cruel kind of poetry in the way Lavinia Fisher is remembered. She may have lived her life as a struggling innkeeper's wife, scraping coins off weary travelers, but she died as a specter, Charleston's eternal villain, the white-dressed bride of the gallows. And here's the part that gnaws. The truth was never what mattered. What mattered was the story and how well it scared. Think about it. No bodies, no smoking gun, no trapdoor bed dragged into the courtroom as Exhibit A. Just whispers, contradictions, and a kind of society that preferred myth over mess. And in the end, they got exactly what they wanted. Not justice, not closure, but theater. A woman dangling at the end of a rope, framed forever as the devil's bride, the ghost who refuses to fade. But peel away the legend for a moment and stare straight into the possibility that Lavinia wasn't a killer at all. Imagine her standing on that scaffold, knowing the crowd wanted a monster, and deciding, fine, let them have one. She gave them defiance. She gave them venom. She gave them a line so cold and perfect that 2 centuries later, we still shiver when we repeat it. If any of you have a message to the devil, tell me now, for I shall be seeing him shortly. And maybe that's the real tragedy, that a woman's fury became her immortality, that her refusal to break, to cry, to fit the mold society demanded of her, sealed her reputation not as a thief, not even as a murderer, but as an eternal haunting. Charleston got his monster, but the question that won't stop echoing is this: was Lavinia Fisher the devil's accomplice, or just another of his victims? Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next case.